The desert had a way of stripping everything down to essentials: heat, sand, distance, and the thin line between survival and collapse. On the morning the Vickers gun would fire for 12 straight hours. British positions west of El Alamein looked unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were about to endure. Lines of shallow trenches, a few sandbagged machine gun pits, and a scattering of camouflaged vehicles seemed almost fragile against the emptiness of open desert. Yet these positions had one advantage the Germans had consistently underestimated: a weapon older than many of the men operating it. Long before the first German probing fire cracked across the battlefield, the British gun crews were already working quietly. The Vickers machine gun, heavy, water-cooled, built on principles older than the war itself, sat on its tripod like a relic of another era. To many German soldiers, it genuinely looked outdated, a museum piece dragged into a conflict dominated by sleeker, faster weapons like the MG-34 and the newly introduced MG-42. But British crews didn't care how it looked. They cared that it worked every time, no matter the conditions. That morning, a Vickers team positioned near a low ridge had already checked the condenser can, topped up the water jacket, and laid out ammunition belts in neat, deliberate coils. Nothing about the routine suggested that the gun was preparing for one of the longest continuous firing actions witnessed in the entire North African campaign. The desert was quiet, broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the faint metallic clatter of German movement beyond the horizon. When the attack finally began, it followed a familiar pattern. German infantry advanced in small, coordinated elements, supported by machine gun teams laying down suppressive bursts. The opening exchange was brief but intense: sharp cracks from Kar 98K rifles, the harsher ripping tone of MG-34 fire, and the slower, deeper pulse of British return fire. What changed everything was when the Vickers crew began their firing cycle. Once the gun opened up, its rhythm didn't stop. Unlike the German air-cooled weapons, the Vickers didn't need pauses to prevent overheating. Its water jacket absorbed the heat, its mechanism stayed cool, and its entire design was built around a steady, relentless delivery of fire rather than short bursts. The crew simply kept feeding belts, cooling water, and adjusting aim as German attempts to move across open ground increased. Minute after minute, then hour after hour, the Vickers maintained its beat. Not frantic, not spectacular, but unwavering. What began as a standard defensive engagement slowly turned into a demonstration of engineering philosophy. The British gun was never designed to impress. It was designed to endure. And as the first hour of sustained firing passed, the German advance had already begun to slow. Not because the British line was impenetrable, but because the Vickers simply refused to stop. As the sun rose higher over the desert, the scale of the engagement became clearer. German commanders had expected the British line to collapse under the familiar pressure of coordinated machine gun fire and infantry maneuver. It was a tactic that worked well against armies relying on lighter, air-cooled guns. But the Vickers ignored the rhythm of German battlefield doctrine. It did not fire in short bursts. It did not require lulls to cool an overheated barrel, and it did not lose effectiveness as minutes stretched into hours. From the German perspective, the British fire seemed strangely constant. Not fast enough to match the intimidating roar of an MG-42, but persistent enough to deny movement across open desert. That contrast mattered. The MG-34 and MG-42 were exceptional weapons. Light, mobile, and capable of delivering blistering rates of fire that made them terrifying in close assaults. Yet, the very features that made them lethal also limited them. A high rate of fire created rapid heat buildup. Air-cooled barrels glowed, warped, and eventually had to be swapped out before they failed. Even well-trained crews were forced to pause, change barrels, and redistribute ammunition. The Vickers crew had no such interruptions. Their work became a kind of mechanical ritual. A steady feed of ammunition belts, periodic refilling of the water jacket, and constant observation of enemy movement. As long as water flowed through the system and belts kept coming, the gun could continue firing. British logistical planning accounted for this. Before major operations, water cans and ammunition boxes were moved into position with the same priority as rations and fuel. In practice, it meant that once a Vickers began sustained fire, it could maintain pressure on the enemy for far longer than its German counterparts. The impact on German infantry was immediate. Attempts to maneuver between sparse patches of cover became increasingly risky. The predictable accuracy of the Vickers, a consequence of its stable tripod, moderate rate of fire, and precise mechanism, made every crossing of open ground a gamble. Units pinned down by its fire often found themselves unable to advance or retreat. What was originally intended as a probing attack turned into a costly standoff, with German machine gun teams unable to suppress the British position long enough to break the line. Behind the British trenches, the rest of the defensive layout functioned around the Vickers. Riflemen watched for flanking attempts. Anti-tank guns remained prepared for armored pushes. Runners moved behind the line carrying ammunition belts and essential supplies. But everything centered on the machine gun that refused to fall silent. As the second hour passed, it became evident that the battle was no longer a contest of speed or aggression. It had become a test of endurance, and in that domain the British weapon proved unmatched. By the time midday heat settled across the battlefield, the engagement had reached a point that German frontline units had not anticipated. Their doctrine relied on suppressive bursts to freeze defenders in place, followed by rapid infantry movement while British guns paused to cool. But the expected pauses never came. The Vickers gun maintained such consistent pressure that German machine gun teams struggled to execute their standard barrel change cycles. Every attempt to shift position or re-establish a firing line drew immediate, accurate fire from the British gun, which seemed capable of tracking any movement across the flat desert. This was the moment when German soldiers began to understand the deeper problem. They had underestimated the water-cooled system entirely. The Vickers was not simply an older design. It was built for a different philosophy of combat, one that valued uninterrupted fire over rapid bursts. German crews, trained on lightweight, high-rate-of-fire weapons, found themselves pinned down by a machine gun whose endurance they had never truly considered. The more they tried to return fire, the more the British gun seemed to tighten its grip on the field. Behind the British position, the gun cruise process remained steady and disciplined. The condenser can hiss gently as steam was captured and cooled back into water. Ammunition runners rotated through the pit, dropping fresh belts and retrieving empty ammunition tins. The crew's focus was not on spectacle but on continuity. Every action was designed to ensure the gun remained operational for as long as the tactical situation required. And in the North African desert, continuity meant everything. Even observers from nearby units began to take notice of the gun's performance. Some had expected mechanical issues to appear after the first hour. Others assumed evaporation in the harsh heat would force the crew to slow firing sooner or later. But the Vickers continued in its unbroken rhythm, demonstrating the value of a design that encapsulated decades of refinement. It was not a weapon meant to win firefights in sudden bursts of violence. It was meant to dominate space through sustained, unrelenting pressure. German reports from that day later reflected a sense of frustration. Their infantry could not advance, their machine gun teams could not suppress, and their mortars struggled to establish accurate trajectories due to British counterfire. What should have been a straightforward pressure maneuver turned into a stalemate under a single weapon's steady beat. Even when German units attempted to reposition on the flanks, the Vickers adjusted its angle with a stability that lighter guns simply could not match. As the third hour passed, it became clear that the British defense had no intention of yielding. And at the center of that defense was a machine gun that seemed to ignore the natural limits other weapons faced under intense heat and prolonged use. The battle was shifting, not through dramatic movements or sudden breakthroughs, but through the quiet realization that one side could outlast the other, hour after hour. By early afternoon, the battle had evolved into something far more revealing than either side initially expected. What began as a German attempt to probe the British line had turned into a sustained demonstration of mechanical endurance and tactical resilience. The Vickers gun, still firing in measured, disciplined cycles, had outlasted multiple German attempts to reset control of the engagement. Each time the Germans regrouped or attempted fresh suppressive bursts, the British gun resumed its steady pressure before they could capitalize on any momentum. This was the point where officers on both sides began recognizing that the engagement's outcome hinged not on maneuver, but on durability. The Vickers was proving exactly why it had earned a reputation across multiple theaters of war. Its slow, almost methodical rate of fire created a rhythm that might seem unimpressive on paper compared to the MG-42's blistering speed, but in practice, the British guns' consistency dominated the field. German teams attempting barrel changes found themselves exposed during critical moments. Their own machine guns, despite superior mobility and innovation, were simply not designed for hour after hour of uninterrupted fire. Meanwhile, the Vickers gun crew maintained their tempo with professional precision. They were used to the demands of the system, the careful topping up of the water jacket, the rotation of ammunition belts, and the constant checks on alignment and stability. There was no urgency in their movement because the gun itself provided the momentum. Every component, from the tripod mount to the water cooling system, functioned exactly as intended, absorbing stress, dispersing heat, and ensuring that the weapon remained a constant presence on the battlefield. The desert environment only amplified the differences between the two philosophies of machine gun design. The fine sand that infiltrated every mechanism posed real problems for German weapons with tighter tolerances and exposed working parts. But the Vickers, enclosed and insulated by its cooling jacket, resisted environmental failure in a way that lighter guns could not. British crews often noted that the weapon remained reliable even when conditions were far from ideal. That reliability now played out in real time, hour after hour, as the gun continued to suppress German movement with unwavering predictability. German infantry, already slowed by the heat and difficult terrain, found themselves pinned at increasing distances. Attempts to bring forward mortars or set up new firing positions were quickly detected and engaged. Even German officers accustomed to aggressive maneuvering had to reconsider their options. Without the ability to silence the Vickers gun, any push risked unnecessary casualties. By mid-afternoon, the German advance had stalled almost completely. What remained was a contest of endurance, a test not of firepower alone, but of which design could maintain consistent battlefield pressure for the longest period. And as the 4th and 5th hours passed without interruption, it became clear the British had built a gun engineered precisely for this scenario. As afternoon shadows lengthened and temperatures began to fall slightly, the battlefield presented an unusual picture. The British position remained largely unchanged, its defenses intact, supported by a machine gun that by now had fired thousands of rounds without a single forced pause. What stood out most was how smoothly the Vickers crew adapted to the demands of prolonged action. The condenser can had been refilled multiple times. Ammunition runners had established a rhythm that resembled a supply chain more than a battlefield scramble. Everything was functioning with a level of mechanical and human coordination that reflected years of doctrinal emphasis on reliability over tempo. For German forces, the situation had become increasingly unsustainable. Their machine gun teams attempted multiple resets, rotating barrels and repositioning to avoid overexposure. Each attempt forced them into a cycle of interruption that the Vickers gun simply did not share. Reports written after the battle described the frustration of trying to match fire with a weapon that showed no signs of mechanical fatigue. German gunners were trained to value overwhelming firepower in the opening minutes of an engagement, but sustained pressure was not part of the MG-34 or MG-42's operational strengths. The Vickers had turned that weakness into a decisive advantage. Throughout the afternoon, German infantry tried limited local advances, testing the British line for weak points. But with every movement came the same response, a calm, steady stream of fire that forced them back into cover. Even when German units attempted coordinated assaults, the timing of their effort was consistently disrupted by the unbroken cadence of the British gun. The Vickers did not allow moments of opportunity to open naturally the way other guns might. The battlefield never quieted, never gave attackers the silence they needed to regroup. Observers later noted that this was one of the first times German troops began expressing open respect for the British machine gun's capabilities in North Africa. They had previously dismissed it as outdated or inefficient, a relic of another era. But after facing it in prolonged combat, many revised their assessments. The Vickers' stability allowed accuracy at ranges where lighter guns struggled. Its cooling system eliminated the threat of overheating, and its crew drills were so refined that the gun could maintain fire almost indefinitely as long as supplies lasted. As the 5th and 6th hours passed, British positions had not only held, they were now pressuring German units to withdraw. Casualties mounted not from rapid bursts of fire, but from the relentless precision of a machine gun that seemed immune to exhaustion. The psychological effect was real. Soldiers pinned for hours under steady fire began losing confidence in the viability of further attacks. When evening approached and the battlefield finally began to quiet, it was clear which weapon had defined the day's outcome. In the days following the engagement, British officers studying the after-action reports noted something striking. The Vickers gun had fired for nearly 12 hours with no mechanical failure, no forced pause, and no degradation in performance. It had done exactly what Victorian engineers intended: deliver sustained, controlled fire in the harshest conditions imaginable. German forces would later record similar experiences across multiple fronts, gradually acknowledging that the weapon they once dismissed as outdated was, in practice, one of the most reliable machine guns on the battlefield. Its endurance, accuracy, and resilience turned the tide in countless engagements, proving that reliability, not innovation alone, defined true battlefield value. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing for more in-depth historical documentaries. Like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know which weapon or battle you'd like to explore next.